Hi there, welcome back. In this screencast, what we are going to do is talk about multi-dimensional arrays. In the last screencast, we talked about arrays in general and saw that there are, in PHP, we have two types of arrays. We have the regular arrays, as regular one-dimensional arrays, and then we saw that a new type of array, which is an associative array, which allows you the freedom of naming your own indexes, whereas in a regular array these indexes are automatically assigned by the system. Now what we are going to do now is talk about multi-dimensional arrays and how to do that in PHP. But before we jump into that, let me just get a basic point out. You see, whenever you are looking at a single dimensional array, you see that you just have these values, right? You just have these values, whereas the indexes are assigned by the system. When you look at associative array, you actually have to keep track of two things. For each item, for each memory location, you have to keep track of two things, which is the name of the key and the value of the key. Over here I'm just keeping track of the value because the indexes are assigned automatically by the system. In an associative array, if you look at this, you're actually looking at two things: the name of the index, the name of the key, and the value of that key. So let me just go ahead and delete all these things. So I'm going to show you that in reality, if you just imagine it, an associative array is actually a two-dimensional array. Okay, it will be something like this. In reality, your array, although it is actually a single dimensional array, but if you imagine it in terms of imagine the associative array in terms of a single dimension array, you will see that we have two rows for each item, where the first row, the first one, okay, I'm going to bring it to the front and then put it over here. So if you remember, we had something like this in the previous class. In the previous screencast, we talked about a few things, where we had the first name and the value of that first name, which was Muhammad, and then we had this last name as the key and the value was Misbahuddin, and finally we had one more, which was the GPA, and we had the value of this as set to 3.75. Now imagine what's going on over here. You see, in a single dimensional array, as I told you, you keep track of only the values, but in case of an associative array, although it's a single dimensional associative array, for each row you have another row which describes or which holds the key values of that row. Now this may not be the physical implementation of the associative array, but this is just for understanding. This is just to visualize how an associative array actually looks like. So whenever you're talking about a single dimensional associative array, you're actually thinking about a two-dimensional regular array, where the first row is actually consisting of the column names. You can call that column names, the key values for each of the items, and then we have the values. So we have to keep track of two things: the key values and the key and the value. Okay, so I hope this was a little clear. Now let's go on and talk about multi-dimensional arrays. Okay, first of all, we'll talk about regular multi-dimensional arrays. So I'm going to just push this down for a little while. So I'm going to talk about multi-dimensional arrays. Okay, this one is too slow, so I'm going to put it down like this. Now we saw how we created a single dimensional associative array. We had two methods of doing that. One of the method was initialization on declaration, and the other method was declaring it first and then initializing it later on. Now how could we do that for a two-dimensional array? Let's suppose that we have a two-dimensional array. So I'm going to just simply copy all these things. Okay, let's just copy these things, put it down over here, and then I'm going to create 2 more dimensions. Okay, so okay, strangely I'm not able to select. Okay, I need to do this. Okay, and I'm going to do this. So we have a 2-dimensional array. This is actually a 2-dimensional array, right? So let's suppose that I want to create this 2-dimensional array. Again, I'm going to call it, this time I'm going to call it students, because I can have more than one student now. I can keep track of this information of more than one student wherever I have these, and that's how we can do that. And suppose that we have these values. We had these values earlier, which was this and this as the first one, and then we had some values for the other ones. Now how do we create a multi-dimensional associative array, multi-dimensional array in multi-dimensional regular array in PHP? We know the concept of a multi-dimensional array. This is a 2-dimensional array because it has 2 dimensions. It has rows and it has columns. It has rows and it has columns. A 3-dimensional array will be the one which has rows and columns and also has a z-axis. That means for each row it also has a sequence of some more rows. Okay, so that would be the 3rd dimension. So for here, what I'm talking about is it's like a cuboid, you know, the Rubik cube, if we can imagine something like that. So now, for simplicity, I'm just talking about a 2-dimensional array, which will be representative of a multi-dimensional array in this case, a 2-dimensional array. So how do we create that? It's simple. Just imagine that in PHP, whenever you are talking about multi-dimensional arrays, each dimension should be considered as an array in itself. So for example, student will be a normal array, student, and each row within that student will be an array. Each row will be an array, a separate 3 separate arrays. So if I'm talking about student, so let's go back into our program and see how we can do that for multi-dimensional arrays. Again, we have 2 ways of doing that. The first one is initialization on declaration. Okay, so how am I going to do that? First let me create the array. So I'm going to say $students equal to an array, right? This is what I was doing earlier. You remember that? This is what I was doing earlier over here. Muhammad array, and then all these 3 were actually the values that I wanted to store. Now, as I told you, in a multi-dimensional array, each row is considered a separate array. So I'm going to go inside, and for each row that I have in my original array, I'm going to create a new array. Okay, so for here I'll have this, then put a comma for the first one, and then go down, then put an array with a comma, and then finally one more array with a comma. We don't need a comma for the last one. So this is how it will look like. The first dimension is this array called students, and the second dimension will be separate arrays, which are rows for the first array, and the number of columns in this will determine the second dimension. So let's go ahead and initialize the array based on the diagram that we had earlier, which is, for example, the first will have exactly the same that we discussed earlier. So I'm going to just go ahead and create that, Muhammad, and then comma 3.75. Okay, the next one I'm going to say Ahmad Okay, and the second dimension would be Hussein, and then let's say the GPA would be 4.00, and then the final one I'll put it as Mujtaba and Ali, and then the GPA would be 3.91. okay, so something like that. So this is how you create a multi-dimensional array. You have to just imagine each of your rows as separate arrays. Okay, so you have to imagine each of your rows as separate arrays. And if I'm going to go ahead and create a three-dimensional array, what I would do, again, you got it right, so for each of these arrays, the third dimension would be again one more array inside it. So if I'm creating something like a three-dimensional array, I would do something like this. I will have an array, and then within that array I'll put some more inside, and then I'll go in and have more arrays inside that. Okay, and then I can put this. So this is how you add dimensions to your arrays. Each dimension would be considered a separate single dimensional array. So that's how you imagine that when you're writing multi-dimensional arrays in PHP. Okay, so this was about how to do that when you want to initialize it on declaration. The other way would be declaration first, which for example for us will be students1 equal to an array, and then the initialization part, I'll just say $students1 0, which will be my index, and then instead of putting the value for that index, I'll again create an array and then initialize the values for that array. So this is Muhammad and then 3.75. Similarly, I keep on repeating the same way. As I told you, if you imagine that each of these rows are arrays in itself, then most of the time your concept will become really clear. Okay, that's how you do that. That's simple. So just the only difference you have to imagine is in the second dimension, each row would be considered as separate arrays. So that's how you visualize a multidimensional array, multidimensional regular array in PHP. Now, how do we print them? Yeah, again, it's the same way you use, and in this case what you would use is a for loop, a nested for loop, so twice, 2 times that case. Okay, let's go ahead and see how can we create a multi-dimensional associative array. That should not be a big difference, because we already have the first dimension. We already created the first dimension, and what it would be like if I'm doing it over here would be something like this. Let's go back to our associative array and see that in an associative array I create an array, and for each item I have these keys and value pairs. Okay, I have these keys and value pairs. So in a multidimensional array, what I would do is I'll create the array. Inside that I have more arrays, and each array would have a key and a value pair. Okay, makes sense? Let's see that. So suppose that I'm going to talk about multi-dimensional associative arrays. In that case, what I can do over here is, first of all, go ahead and let's say initialize the array. I like the other way of doing that, although the first way is also possible, but we are going to just talk about the declaration and then initialization part. So I'm going to just go ahead and say I have an array which is student underscore assoc, which is an array. which is an array, and then what I do is for the first dimension I do the same thing. I use $student underscore assoc and use a bracket, and I put an identifier. Now this can be your unique way of identifying the student itself. It can be his first name, it can be his ID as well. So let's say I'm going to put his ID. So I'm going to say 21101 is his ID. It can be an integer, as I told you. It can be an integer, it can be a floating point, or it can be a string. We used strings in the previous one, if you remember that. We use this as strings. I can use this as a normal. But in the other way, since it's a multi-dimensional associative array, I have to use the array, and then within that I define my key and value pairs. So that would be first, and then I will put Muhammad, comma, and then the next one would be last name, and then I have this as Spahaddin, and then finally we have GPA, whose value is 3.75, and then I keep on repeating that. Student underscore assoc, and this time I have under ID 21102, array, and then I have to, because see, I have to repeat the keys now because I didn't remember it. It's associated with each of those rows individually. Ahmed, and then the last name is Hussein, comma, the GPA would be 4.00, and then one more. Okay, we have $student underscore assoc, and then 21103, and then I have array, and the first one would be first, which is Ishtaba, then I have last, which will be Ali, and then I have GPA, which will be 3.91. Okay, so that's how I create my multi-dimensional associative array. As you can see, my first dimension would be these IDs, and my second dimension would be the name and the value pairs. So if you visualize that in terms of an associative array, and in terms of a regular array, you can find that this looks like a three-dimensional array. Although it's a two-dimensional associative array, it looks like a three-dimensional associative array where the first index, so because the way you access it, because you see, if I want to access any element inside this array, I would do something like that. Student underscore assoc, the first index would be my first dimension, which is 21101. The second dimension would be my key, so it will be first, and then the third dimension is actually the value of that key. The third dimension will be the value of that key. So it looks like three-dimension, but in reality it is actually a two-dimensional associative array. That is the reason why we have this second index. Whereas in the case of in the multidimensional regular array, what we have over here is, how do we access that? We just use this way. We say $students, and then we provide the first dimension would be like 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we can provide the second dimension, which is whatever we have normal, like for example 0, 0, and then we have this. So you can imagine that in the second dimension I would have something like this. Okay, so this is how it looks like. Now let's go ahead. This just shows you basics about how to create multi-dimensional arrays for both regular and associative arrays. Now let's go ahead and talk about the project that we were discussing when we started PHP, which was buy from me. We stopped at a point where we created a few pages. We were able to go back to the project. We were able to reuse the header and the footer, and based on that we were able to create two new pages, which were the stuff page and the contact page. Although it's empty, we need to fill that a little later on. And we saw that we encountered a few problems during that, and we solved those problems using variables and conditional statements. Now in this screencast, I'm going to talk about the stuff array. Now the stuff array usually has a list of items inside it. So you see, as these items, although these items are limited and they are static, what I want to do is I want to create an array of these items and then display that array, and for using that array, display each one of that item from that array. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how we can do that. Let's open I'm going to just save this array.php page, and then I'm going to just close it. So this is my stuff.php page. You remember that I created the $stuff and then title stuff, and then I included the header and the footer over here. Now what I want to do now is to create the content part of it. So I'm going to have a div tag with, I'm not sure if we had a class content or ID is equals to content. I'm just going to open my contact.php page and then copy this structure that we already had. Okay, so I'm going to just put this structure over there from that page. Now instead of using contact me, I'm going to use my stuff collection. Okay, now within that, what I want to do is I want to create a list of all the items. So I have an unordered list with a class called products. This class will actually tell me how to format my products, the list of items that I have over here, and for each item I use a list item. Okay, now each item is clickable, so I have to use a hyperlink them, because if I click on that item I should look at the description of that page. So I create an href. Now within that I need to use image, and image has two attributes, which is source and alt, and then finally I want to use a paragraph of mentioning view details. So to tell the user that whenever he clicks on it, I want to see how it looks like. So I'm going to save this because I don't have any image. I'm not sure if it'll appear normally. So you can see that it's like not very aligned properly. So it's going to be something like this, like the page that we have over here with these three items. It should show me the image, should show me view details at the bottom, and this as a box. So I think I'm missing a class, but let's go to our home page and see if I'm missing a class. Yeah, I'm missing one class, so I'm going to just use that. And then I'm going to go back to my stuff.php page. Yeah, I don't have anything, so let's do that a little later on. Okay, let's see after we add items how it looks like. After we add images, how does it look like? Now, okay, the stuff.php page. Suppose I already have an image. Let's use image slash stuff slash, let's say the first image is something like this, right? So I'm going to go back and see how it might look like. Yeah, it looks too big. Something is not right. I have UL class products. LI href source view detail. I'm pretty sure I don't have a wrapper, so probably that might be causing it. You don't have a wrapper around this. Okay, let's do that. still. Copy it over here. This page should be here. I'm pretty sure I don't need the wrapper. Just delete that for now. Then refresh it. Yeah. So that looks good. Yeah, so that looks good, right? So I'm just checking if my voice is there to avoid any circumstance. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an array for each of those products. I'm going to go at the top over here and create an array for each of those products. So let me call that array stuff. So I'm going to say $stuff and say equal to an array. It's an associative array. I'm going to work with associative arrays to get experience based on that. So I'm going to create a stuff array, and inside that stuff array, what I want to do is to store the items. Now for that items, I'm going to do one thing. Stuff. Let's call that items as stuff 101, and I want to create another index which will be array. So that's the second dimension, and then I need to keep some properties of those items. So the first property that I'm going to put over there to remember is, let's say, the image. Let's have the name of the product. Let's have the name of the product. Let's say, let me call that name, and for that name, let me use the first one as the picture that I used was Amazon Kindle, right? Then comma. After that, I have the second dimension. Let's call that second dimension the image. So I'm going to use img to call it an image, and then the value of that image will be the path that I have over here. So I'm going to say img slash stuff slash stuff 101.jpg, and then the third one, I want to keep track of the price of that item, which I'll use later on. So I'm going to say price, and that price, the value would be, say, 500. Okay, so this will be my first dimension. So suppose I have this array, right? Suppose I have this array with this item. Let's add one more item. Let's add one more item. Say $stuff 102 array, and then I'm going to repeat the same thing. Name. Let's call it stmode beacon, comma. I am going to use the image, and the same image slash stuff slash stuff dash 102.jpg, and then finally the price of it, which will be, let's say, $9.99. Okay, so let's hope that we have these two elements inside our associative array, which is a two-dimensional associative array. The first dimension will be the ID that I have over here, and the second dimension is the value of the keywords, which is name, image, and price. Okay, so now let's do that. Let's use that to work with our array. So what I need to do over here is, for each of those elements, I want to repeat this list element, because I don't want to keep it static. I want to use the array to actually change how many items I have. So for that, you remember, you can use the for each loop that we discussed earlier. So I'm going to add some PHP code to my HTML. So I'm going to add the delimiters and then say for each, and inside that for each, what I'm going to do is use the stuff array as my working variable, which is I. Let's call it I. Okay, and I'm going to close my array over here because I want to repeat until for each of the items I want to repeat the list item so that it can display it. Okay, now when I'm repeating it, I want to replace the image. Here I wrote the image by hand, right? So I'm going to replace this from the array itself. So now my array is $i. I don't need to write the first dimension because the first dimension will be automatically added because I'm using for each. As you remember, for each, it will use it for each instance. So the first instance is automatically given. If you don't want the value of the first instance, you just use $i, and into the bracket you use the key value that you need for over here. So the second dimension, I mean. So the second dimension is what I need over here is img, right? But since this is a PHP code, I have to use PHP inside it. Use echo $i image semicolon and then close that part. Similarly, I have to do the same thing with alt. Alt is an alternative text that we use for images, and over here I'm going to put the name of my product as an alternative. So I'll use name this way. So that should be it. So I'm going to use the image and the name from my array that I declared over here. So that's how I use my multidimensional array. Remember that whenever you're using multidimensional arrays, over in the previous one, whenever you're working with a working variable, we just used that I. Let me go back and show it to you so that you still remember that. Arrays. Yeah, you see that whenever I was printing the array, printing an associative array, I was actually just talking about $i. I didn't put the index over here because the index was automatically assigned, because each $i, the difference between this $i, you remember I told you that the difference between this $i and the one that we use in the regular for loop is very different, because this one, this $i is actually the index, the counter. Whereas on the other hand, for each, this $i is the working variable. That means it contains the whole the value of this, the value of that array for that instance. I mean, it keeps on repeating for each instance and it holds the value of that instance, and it's not just a counter. Similarly, when you are working with multidimensional arrays, the same thing happens. The same thing happens over there. So over here, I'm using $stuff as $i. So $i will keep on repeating, changing the instance. So $i in the first iteration will be 101, $i in the second iteration will be 102. So what I need is the next dimension, which is the second dimension, which I care about is which property of this array that I am concerned about. So I have name, image, and price. I'm concerned about image, so that's why I'm going to use image over here. Over here in the alt, I'm concerned about name, that's why I used name. So $i, this will be actually translated into $stuff 101 name, and the next iteration it will be $stuff 102 and name, and it keeps on repeating for all instances of the stuff array until it's done, and keeps on repeating this for each loop and adding this list items to each one of my on the page. So I'm going to save this page, and let's go back and run our program. So you can see now that I have two products using the for each loop. The first one over here is the Kindle, Amazon Kindle, and the second one over here is the Estimote Bluetooth beacon. Okay, now I want to have a list of elements to fill this up, so I don't want you to type all those elements. So what I did is, if you remember the website that I was using to give you the original code that I've started working with, I added this code for lecture 8, which is PHP multidimensional arrays, a text file. Now if you open this text file, you can see that an array that I was just talking about is already created, starting from the item number 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, and 108, and then simply we have the name, the image, and the price for each of them. So I'm just going to copy this all and then paste it over here in my code, back over here at the top. I had a small mistake, so I'm going to fix that in the original file. So this is how it looks like. So I have a 103, 104. Well, it's like not aligned properly, so I'm going to push it inside so that it's aligned properly. So I have this, the first 104, 105, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to just simply go back and refresh my page, and you will see what happened was I have this 3 items, and then I have more, and I have a list of total 8 items, and each of these items are stored in a multi-dimensional associative array, where the first dimension is the ID of that product, and the second dimension includes key and value pairs, and these keys are name, image, and price. Okay, so that's how we do multi-dimensional arrays in PHP. Hope you understood that, because this concept is heavily going to be used in future screencasts. See you later.